Hi, welcome back everyone. If you're new here, my name is Holly Walter and I discuss all things landscape photography, whether it be on-location vlogs, gear reviews, or tutorials. And if you haven't already, please go down and subscribe and ring the bell so you can stay up to date on what is happening over here. Now in this episode, I'm going to discuss a popular post-processing technique called the Orton Effect. It goes by many names such as Orton Imagery, Orton Slide Sandwich, Orton Glow, but its most common alias is the Orton Effect. Now, a little history nugget on the Orton Effect. It was originated by one Michael Orton during the 1980s. He would take two images of the same scene, one correctly exposed and one slightly out of focus and of a brighter exposure. These two images combined in darkroom would create a dreamy or ethereal emotion in his final images. Back then, this technique wasn't widely accepted among the landscape photography community. But nowadays, many photographers use this technique to create greater emotion within their images. Now today, I'm going to discuss a few methods on how to achieve the Orton Effect, including using Lightroom as well as Photoshop with and without using Luminosity Masks. Now, let's hop on over to the computer and let's get started. Alright, now first things first, in Lightroom, all images that I'm going to be using today are all fully edited except for having the Orton Effect put on. My image right here, waterfall with a log going across the foreground as a leading line. So to create a Orton Effect in Lightroom, first thing you're going to want to do is do some sort of adjustment layer. So you can use a linear filter, radial filter, or a brush. I am going to use a brush today. So in the brush, if you already have things, the adjustment sliders that are adjusted, just double tap on Effect, and that'll reset all of those right there. So first things first, this is my technique, what I like to do to my photos. It's all dependent on what type of artistic expression you're wanting on your images. So you can take my adjustments with a grain of salt. This is just what I like to do and the things that I adjust when I do my Orton Effect. So first thing I like to do is I like to warm it up. Add a little bit of warmth, a little bit of magenta. I'm also going to increase the exposure. Just a little bit, not quite that much. And then adding in some contrast. I do a little bit more contrast than I do the exposure, but just a tad. And then I come down to saturation and I saturate it a bit. So now, size is a little big, so I'm going to small that down. Now you can either do it over the entirety of the image, or what you can do is just go over the highlights. Big thing with the Orton Glow is when you're in real life and you're seeing a little bit of the ethereal feel to it, only the highlights glow. Shadows are not meant to glow. It gives a little bit of a weird feeling to the image. So I've got quite a few highlights in my image here, especially within the waterfall, on the foliage, as well as on the log. So what I'm going to do is, I've got a smaller size brush. My feather, I've got fairly small. And then I don't want a very high flow because the higher flow, the less you're going to be able to reduce it. So start small and then gradually work your way up, especially with the flow. And I'm going to keep bringing the density down a bit as well. There we go. So then I'm just going to start painting in the areas I want to see a little bit of the Orton Effect. Go ahead and turn my overlay on so you can see where I'm painting. Now with the feather, it is going to touch many spots within my image. So I'm essentially kind of just painting over the entire image. You can do it with radial filter also, so however you want to go about it. So I'm going to turn this off. Now you can see everything kind of increase. So I turn off and on. Everything just kind of started to take that effect. One thing I forgot to do is decrease sharpness. Decreasing it all the way. Big thing with the Orton Effect is that the second image was taken as, when Michael Orton did it, the second image was taken as slightly out of focus and a higher a brighter exposure. So that's one thing that we want to try to replicate within our image. So decrease that sharpness. You can also do it with the clarity a little bit if you want. I don't do a whole lot, just a tad. But since it is affecting the entirety of our image, we need to isolate the highlights from those shadows. So to do that, we're going to use a range mask. So down here in Lightroom 2020, I'm going to do luminance. Now right here for the range, these are going to be our shadows. These are going to be our highlights. So what we're wanting to do is decrease the amount of our Orton effect leaking into our shadows. So what we can do, we can hold down Alt, grab our shadows, bring it in to where just our highlights are being affected by the Orton effect. So now when we turn it on and off, I can hit it, there we go. The Orton effect is only affecting our highlights. It's not leaking into the shadows. It's not giving off that muddy look. So you can always adjust this however you want. It's gonna be very different depending on the type of image. And then you can do this with smoothness as well. Press and hold down Alt. So the further to the left towards the shadows is gonna make it much more contrasty. So when you're working with masking, luminosity masks, range masks, you need to remember that white reveals and black conceals. So anything that is white is going to show whatever it is that we're painting onto our scene. Anything that's black is not going to be painted on. It's not going to show any of that. So smoothness, farther right we go, the more that Orton effect is going to bleed into our shadows. So a little contrasty, not too contrasty. I'm liking it right there. See how it is turning on and off. There we go. Big thing to remember is when in real life, when you do see a little bit of that glow, a little bit of that haziness in your image due to atmosphere or what have you, is that it's not overly saturated, it's not overly done. You want to be very considerate with how much you put onto your image. Again, artistic effect, however you want your final images to be created is all up to you, but be tasteful with it. Don't have it cranked up. Let's say I cranked up my yellows and cranked up my magentas and just started going nuts. It's not going to look as real as it would have in real life. So I like to replicate what I see when I am on location, as well as give a little bit of artistic flex on the image. So that's Lightroom. All right, so now over here in Photoshop, we're gonna do something very similar to what we did in Lightroom. So first things first, I come on over here, click my group 1, that's all of my adjustments that I've done previously. So open that up, you can see all those adjustment layers. Now I'm gonna make a merged visible layer. So what I'm gonna do is on a PC, I'm gonna hit Control-Alt-Shift-E. On a Mac, you'll hit Command-Option-Shift-E. That's going to create my layer 3, which is a merged visible layer. So what that does is it copies everything that's below that layer all into one layer. So now from here, I'm going to go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. So what the Camera Raw Filter is the equivalent to Lightroom, so I can do all these same adjustments here and it will only affect that layer. So now, just like what we did in Lightroom, we're going to start making our adjustments that we want to go into our Orton effect. So with my temperature, I'm going to start increasing the temperature, get some yellows in there. Adjust my tint, get some magentas. Then I'm going to take my exposure, bring it up. Again, you don't want to pop those highlights. You don't want to start having your highlights blow. So drop that right there. Now I'm going to give it some vibrance and some saturation. Hit OK. Now go back up to Filter. Now we're going to do Blur, Gaussian Blur. So we didn't do any of the sharpness or clarity settings in the Adobe Camera Raw, but what we can do is we can use a blur filter in Photoshop. Lightroom doesn't have that, so this is the one nice thing about Photoshop. So here in my Gaussian blur, I'm set at a radius of 23.4. I like to use a radius that's a similar number of pixels as my camera sensor. So my camera sensor is a 24.1 megapixel sensor. So I do 23.4. I found it's kind of the sweet spot for mine. So kind of just play around with it, experiment, find what works well for your camera, and well, just go with it. Hit OK. Great image, great image. So now what we're gonna do here is we're gonna readjust our eyes. Bring the opacity down all the way to 0. You just assaulted it with all that brightness, all of that warmth. So now we get to get back to our base image. So from here, we're going to slowly increase our opacity on the image. So I like to stay right around in the teens. I'll go up in the 20s just to show you what's going on. So notice how we're getting some of that dreamy, ethereal effect. Turn it off and on. But as you can see in like my shadows down here, the shadows are starting to glow. We don't want that. So I'm going to keep the opacity where it's at. Make sure my layer is selected. Go up to layer, go up to image, adjustments, levels. You can do curves, but I'm a bigger fan of levels. That's just what I like to do. So now from here is where we can isolate our highlights from our shadows. So what I like to do is I like to bring down my right slider, which is the highlight slider, down just until it starts getting into the histogram here. Sorry, the RGB gram. And then I'm going to take my mid-tone slider and I'm going to slide it towards my highlights and start to isolate the highlights from the shadows. I like it right about there. Then we're going to hit OK. So now when we turn it off and on, see we get that nice dreamy feel to it, but our shadows aren't glowing. It's not giving that really weird effect. So that's creating an Orton effect without using any luminosity masks in Photoshop. The next thing we're going to do is in Photoshop, but with luminosity masks with software such as Lumenzia or TK Actions. The one I'm going to do today is using Lumenzia. So here's back to my base image. As you notice, no Orton effect or anything like that. So same thing, Control-Alt-Shift-E or Command-Option-Shift-E. Create a new merged visible layer. Same thing, back up to filter, Adobe Camera Raw. Adjust your settings as appropriate or as needed, whatever type of effect you're wanting to go for. Hit OK. Now same thing, we're going to add another Gaussian blur. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Hit OK. Now, a different way to isolate our highlights from our shadows is using luminosity masks. So panels such as Lumenzia, TK Actions, Raya Pro, they're great because they already have luminosity masks built in. And that's their whole job, is creating luminosity masks. So to isolate our highlights from our shadows, here in Lumenzia Pro, I've got my darks, my midtones, and then my lights. So lights are going to be our highlights. So I'm going to hit my lights 1. You see all the white, that's going to be my highlights. White reveals, black conceals. So I like that, so it's going to show exactly where I want it to. And then I can just hit mask. And what it's going to do is it's going to put a layer mask on top of that layer that we made for our Orton effect. Now same thing, bring our opacity down all the way to 0, start at our base image, and slowly bring that opacity back up. Again, I like it right around in the teens. You can bring it up, I'm going to bring it up into the 30s for now. So turn it off and on. Now you can see it's affecting the highlights in the trees, the water, as well as some of the highlights here of the reflections on this log and the other foliage. But it's not going into the shadows right down in here. So there you have it. creating the Orton Effect in Lightroom and Photoshop with and without luminosity masks. Each technique has its pros and cons, but no matter which type of post-process you are, it is possible to create that dreamy or ethereal look in your images fairly easy. Now, I hope this tutorial has either taught you something new or has helped you with this technique. Please comment below on your experience with the Orton Effect and whether you're a fan of this look or not, and how you incorporate it into your own workflow. If you liked this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Ring that notification bell, that way you stay up to date on the happenings of this channel. I hope everyone is staying safe during this time, and if you are on the stay-at-home orders such as myself, take this time to learn something new or fine-tune skills that you have in your back pocket. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!